Hello everyone, and a good day to you all. I wanted to give some recommendations today on AK-47 7.62 by 39 magazines. From my experience, I've tried quite a few different AK mags, especially recently as I've been doing this whole build here, which I've recently finished. A little over a year ago, I did a video on AK-74 magazine recommendations, and I'm going to follow a fairly similar format here. So let's go ahead and get started first with some just general things that you should look for when picking up AK mags, and then I'm going to go ahead and kind of talk about my experience with different mags that I've used and how they've held up. So the general criteria you should be looking for when selecting magazines, even if it's just for the range, because they will last way longer if you pick up ones that have steel reinforcement. Specifically, you're going to want to find magazines that have steel reinforcements on the front and rear locking lugs, as well as on the feed lips. Now, there are a lot of magazines out there that also do not have any steel reinforcement, and they're just pure polymer. The reason that you want to avoid those, so to start with, the locking lugs, those, if they're polymer, are going to probably fail the quickest. So the reason that I would recommend this on an AK, and also the reason you don't really need it on an AR, is because of how it loads. So your rear lug here, of course your front, you catch it in the magazine well there, and then your rear lug, as you're inserting the magazine, it does rub up against your magazine release until it gets in there. Now, over time, as you keep doing that over and over, it is going to, just because one of these surfaces is harder than the other, you're going to wear down your rear lug if it is polymer. When it's steel, it'll last significantly longer. Now, as for the steel feed lips, the reason that is important is you actually do have, when you load this into the AK, you get a little bit more pressure on the feed lips than you do on an AR. And some AKs it actually is a little bit more, some are a little bit less, just depending on how it fits together. But generally you are going to have a bit more pressure on your feed lips. So having steel reinforced feed lips is a very good thing to have. The magazine, however, will not fail anywhere near as long if you have full polymer feed lips. I would still say to avoid those, but if you have a lot of them and it's just for like range practice, it'll work fine. They'll hold up pretty well. They will eventually crack, and the steel feed lips will last significantly longer. But the biggest thing to look for is the steel locking lugs. Now, if you're not sure if the magazines you already own have steel reinforcement, a good way to test that is to disassemble it, take out the spring, and just do a magnet test. Just take your standard, just a fridge magnet, and just put it up against the feed lips and the lugs, and that'll be a good indication of whether you have steel. There's one magazine I found that is an exception to that, and I'm not sure if that's because they use some different form of metal or if maybe they demagnetized it, but I'll talk about that one later. The last thing I like to have on my magazines, and most of them will have this, is a fully loaded indicator. Generally, that's going to be a hole drilled in the rear of the mag, as you can see right there at the back. And when you fully load the mag up to 30, you'll be able to see the last round in there just sticking out a little bit. So that's what to generally look for, and then what I would recommend in an AK magazine. Now, where it gets a bit more into the nuance and into the weeds a little bit is that not all magazines are created equal, even when they have all the steel reinforcement and steel locking lugs and all of that. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about most of the mags that I've picked up over the years and how they perform and how I would recommend them. And I'm going to go ahead and start with what I would say is probably the best magazine that I would hands down recommend by far, is the Circle 10s. These are normally available in just black. There's a few limited, more kind of collector's variants of these in tan and I believe green and maybe plum. I'm not sure on that. But generally you'll find these in black. They're not terribly expensive, at least when I'm recording this. These are about $50 each. I usually pick these up from Atlantic Firearms. I think these are a phenomenal magazine. The reason for that, first off, as I've already been pointing out, because this is the magazine I was referencing, this does have steel feed lips, this does have steel locking lugs, it does have the fully loaded indicator in the back. One tertiary feature that I do like of the steel reinforcement that does help for the longevity is a lot of, I would say the higher end of the really well-built magazines are going to have a steel reinforcement on the front. Generally, the Russian ones are going to go about a third or a half of the way down, so right about here. The Circle 10 magazine, however, that I have right here, this is the only magazine I have that actually has a complete steel reinforcement across the entire front surface. So I really do like that a lot. It is by far not the most important feature. As I said earlier, the most important things to have are steel feed lips and steel locking lugs, but every little bit of just extra reinforcement is nice. And being that this is, in all the rest of the areas, is polymer, it does weigh a little bit less. So that brings me to my next point. I've been talking a lot about steel reinforcements. Why am I recommending a magazine that's a polymer mag and not the very common type of mags, your surplus magazines like I have here? This is a Romanian one. The reason for that is just weight. Generally, you don't need as much, you don't need the whole thing to be steel for it to be a solid magazine, as I've been pointing out with that Circle 10. That is a phenomenal mag, but more on this magazine later. The next magazine I would recommend that is significantly cheaper than the Circle 10 is actually another Bulgarian mag, and that is these so-called commercial manufacturer ones, and you can get them pretty much anywhere. They're modern manufacture. They look kind of similar to like your AK-103 magazines. Of course, they're not. They're Bulgarian, just slab side and all that. One thing on these, make sure that you are getting the steel reinforced version, because they do have a unreinforced version. The price difference is not worth it. It's only slightly less expensive to get the full polymer version. So for that little bit of a difference in price, just get the full steel reinforced one. It'll last way longer. Now, the reason that these ones aren't my top pick, they're still nice and light because they're polymer. They don't weigh an excessive amount. And they do still have the reinforcements for feed lips and for the front and rear locking lugs. However, I have had some issues with these, and I believe when I did, they make these in 545 as well for the 74s. When I did my original video on this, I had no issues, and I recommended these hands down as being probably the best overall for the price and for performance. But when it gets really cold, I've noticed I actually have some feeding issues with these. So I'm not sure what it is, but it does seem like some of the materials they used in this are temperature sensitive. And I've also heard stories from people who've been shooting with these types of mags in really, really hot weather as well, which I never really get around here. But apparently they don't really work as well there either. So something to keep in mind here is they may not work in every environment that well. And I would love to hear your experiences with them as well, if you've been using them in particularly hot or cold weather, to hear if they kind of match my experiences. But then the next magazine I would recommend is the surplus one that I brought up from earlier. Now, there is a ton of surplus magazines you can find out there. I own a lot of Romanian ones just because they came with this. This is a Wasser 10. They'll vary in price. You can get these for dirt cheap, or you can get them a little bit more expensive if you want to go like collect. But these are great. My only complaint, as I've been kind of bringing up, is they are a little bit heavier. One other thing that you'll kind of see fail a lot, and I haven't ever had it actually cause an issue, but right here on the front, it's going to be hard to see, but at the front of this part of the follower, right here, you'll tend to get some cracking. And two of my Romanian surplus magazines like that have a crack right there. It has never affected function. I have never had a single malfunction with these magazines. They're full steel, of course, so they're going to be extremely durable. And also they're really, really cheap, as I said, with just a few exceptions. I've had great luck with the Romanian ones. I've actually tried some of these. These are Croatian magazines. I'm not sure if it's the magazine body itself or the follower, because I did pick these up because I thought it was kind of cool that these have a bolt hold open follower. I've had quite a few feeding issues with these Croatian bolt hold open magazines, and I've also not, even when it does perform without issue, I haven't had it always hold open. Generally, it actually doesn't hold open. Now, that might be what, just with my rifle, I wouldn't be surprised, but just haven't had that good of luck with these, so I kind of kept it just for the video, but I don't really use it all that often. Pardon the transition, it was getting a little cold here. So the next magazine that I would recommend is the KCIs. Now, these look very similar to the surplus magazines. As you can see, the only difference is, or I should say the only visual difference, is that these have more of a shiny type of finish. These are generally about the same price as the surplus magazines. They seem to also be made out of a little bit thinner of sheet metal than those. So overall, I don't really see why you would go with these. Maybe in the future when things change with the surplus market, but at least for right now, I don't see why you would pick these up over the surplus mags. Well, Granted, I haven't had any issues with these either, so maybe you can find them on a good deal or something somewhere, in which case go for it. Otherwise, in every case, I would recommend the surplus magazines. I guess the only thing I could say that is good about these that you'll sometimes run into with surplus magazines is these are always just, they're brand new manufacture. If you pick up some of the surplus mags, they may not be in the best of condition, so just kind of watch that when you're picking up the surplus magazines compared to these. But even then, you can tend to clean up even magazines that are in pretty bad condition with rust and all that, except for the really bad examples. Generally, you can get them to functional condition, and sometimes you'll be surprised with how well they clean up. But at least for the 30 rounders of these KCIs, I've never had any issues with them. When you get to the bigger ones, like the 40 rounders, I owned 2 of those in the past, and I had a lot of feeding issues with both of them. I think it was just an underpowered spring in them. I think they may have been using the same springs in the 30s and the 40s, perhaps. Either way, would avoid the 40 rounders. I've had bad luck with them. And if you want to pick up the 30s, as I showed there, then they should be good to go. The next magazine that I do quite like is the iconic Bakelite magazine. At least it's called Bakelite. It does resemble Bakelite, but this is actually made out of AG4 polymer, interestingly enough. Now, one thing to look out for on Bakelite magazines is there are several generations of these, and not all of them are steel reinforced. The one I have here does have steel feed lips, and it does have steel locking lugs, and does have a steel reinforcement in the front. As I said, that goes about halfway down. You can kind of see a hump on it. If you look at just about from that angle, there's a little bit of a hump there where the steel is. And these are good mags. I have never had any issues with these at all. The only reason that I'm not recommending these higher is just I wanted to get this because Bakelite's kind of an iconic look and all of that, especially for AKs, but they are getting very hard to find and they are very expensive. But you can still find them here and there. RussianSurplus.net. They have a good selection of Bakelites, and they're not terribly expensive. And you can occasionally find these on Gunbroker, but that is a place where the price on them does get a little out of control sometimes. Next is the XTech. I've been meaning to pick up some of these mags for, I think, right around the time that I did that AK-74 magazine recommendations video, and I finally did just a few weeks ago. Now, one thing you need to watch out for, this is the MAG47 MIL from XTech. Their other magazines do not have the same level of reinforcement, so if you go with the XTech magazines, I would recommend going with the MIL version only. The MIL version has your front and rear steel reinforced locking lugs, and it does have steel feed lips. However, 2 things I don't like about this magazine: it doesn't have the fully loaded indicator in the rear there, and I also don't like that there's actually no reinforcement here. As I said, kind of a tertiary feature, but I do like to have it, and most of the military magazines from Russia and Bulgaria do have it. But this has no steel reinforcement in the front here, so it doesn't matter as much, but it is a little bit less reinforcement than I would prefer. Otherwise, these are good. These are pretty affordable as well, and I haven't had any feeding issues with them. Now here is the next magazine I wanted to talk about. This is pretty similar to the XTech from before. This is the US Palm AK30. US Palm also makes the AK30R, which doesn't have steel reinforcement, so avoid that one. Now this is the one I was referring to earlier. That's kind of weird. This is supposed to have steel reinforced locking lugs, however it does not have steel feed lips. I'm not sure if it has any steel reinforcement anywhere else. It's supposed to have a steel reinforced cage. However, I think they may have demagnetized it because I'm not getting anything whenever I put the magnet up to it anywhere. Also, I cannot disassemble this, which is a huge negative. They claim you'll never need to disassemble this because you can just rinse it out. They do have holes, similar, actually pretty much exactly the same as this XTech here, you can see. They have holes in the follower, so if you get mud in it when you drop it out of your gun or anything like that, you can wash it out. But I kind of worry if there would be, if you maybe get like small pebbles or something in it, or maybe just more coarse sand, stuff like that, that it maybe wouldn't come out as easily. Not really a fan of this mag. I own one because I just wanted to try it out. Another thing also that I don't really like about these AK30s, now I should also mention, although these are a polymer feed lip, and still, that's not good, go with steel feed lips, but I will say this will probably last a while. I haven't had any issues with it so far. These feed lips are thick as hell. I've never seen a magazine with this thick of feed lips. This whole magazine just the entire magazine body is overbuilt. It sits quite thick in the gun. I also don't like how tight it is. It's kind of hard to release. Your mileage will vary depending on your rifle, because if you just get ever so slightly larger of a mag well that where it's still in tolerances, then it won't be as bad. And this one also does not have the fully loaded indicator. I don't know if I already mentioned that or not. The next magazine I wanted to talk about is the Magpul PMAG. I just have one of the 10 rounders just for use when I'm zeroing like off the bench and all of that. So this one does not have any steel reinforcement. I believe that the newer generation of PMAGs does have steel locking lugs. However, they still don't have steel feed lips. And their polymer on their feed lips is not that thick either. So I don't think these will last that long, and for the price you can pick up a bunch of these other mags that I've been recommending for about the same, sometimes even less with some of the surplus magazines. So I would just recommend to go that route rather than picking up any of these. Next I wanted to talk about the PufGun magazine. Depending on the exact model, maybe I would even put this higher on the list, but I only own these transparent magazines. So these are just polymer feed lips. They make an opaque version that does have steel reinforced feed lips. They also make fully just polymer versions, so also watch out if you pick up any of these. These are Russian manufactured magazines, so they're a little harder to get, which is also why I don't really recommend them as much, but they are still available, which is why I'm still going to talk about them. These are a very weird magazine. It may not look like it, like it's just like the only weird looking thing about it is that it's polymer, but I have had more just bizarre issues with this. Never when I'm actually shooting, but it's almost like there's a break-in period with this magazine, which is very odd. When I very first got these, actually I own 2 of these magazines, and with both of these, when I first got these, you go to load in 30 and it's gonna get stuck around, I believe I got around 10, and then it would stick. I would unload it all the way, try to load it again, and they'd get down to about 20, dump the mag out again, and then fully load it up to 30. What I think was happening was maybe the follower itself was getting stuck on the magazine body, and then it just almost maybe needed to stretch out a bit because it's polymer. I'm not actually sure what was going on with that, but it was pretty bizarre. And I've never had that happen with any other magazine, and I usually regard a break-in period as being a manufacturing flaw. However, after I did that, these have worked flawlessly. They won't last that long, of course, because these are not reinforced on the feed lips. They do have reinforced lugs. So, decent that way. The last magazine that I wanted to talk about that would be more of a just avoid at all costs, that I actually don't have here because I threw it away. Well, actually there's 2 magazines in specific that I would recommend to avoid. That is TAPCO and ProMag. I owned one of each quite a while ago. Back when I didn't know any better, and I saw them in a sports shop and I thought, wow, those are really cool looking magazines. They, I guess, kind of are, but they're really, really bad. If I remember right, the rear lug on the ProMag cracked off entirely, or it may have just worn down really, really rapidly. Either way, they stopped functioning entirely after a few uses at most. So those suck, and I would recommend to avoid them. Again, there's not even that much of a difference in price between a ProMag and a TAPCO and just some of these surplus magazines. So that is all the magazines I wanted to talk about in this video. To bring things back around, the magazine I would recommend as being the best overall by far would be the Circle 10 magazine. However, a very close second is just going to be the surplus stamped steel magazines, and country of origin doesn't matter too much on these. As I said, I've had the best luck with the Romanian ones. I'm sure that the Russian, the Ukrainian re-arsenaled ones, and a bunch of the other, pretty much every former comm bloc country has these types of mags. And aside from the Croatian ones, they'll probably all work well. And maybe even in your gun, the Croatian ones will work well as well. The only thing I would say to just make sure that you're picking up either magazines that are in excellent condition on the website when it comes to the surplus magazines, or ones that are in good condition that you're willing to spend the time to clean up. But if you take those magazines that are in really bad condition when you get them and you clean them up, you can even use WD-40 if you're careful with it, and get some degreaser and all of that and clean it up, and you can even heat it up to get a little bit more of the rust out that way. You will be surprised with how well some of these magazines can get cleaned up. Thank you all for watching. Let me know if you have any other questions about any of the magazines I covered or about anything else about the mags in the comments below. Also, would love to hear if you have other experiences with other magazines that you would recommend that I didn't talk about, because this is by no means an exhaustive list. It's very far from it. I have a lot of different magazines, but I don't have all of them. I haven't tried every single magazine in the world. So there might be some out there that are still readily available that I haven't even tried. They're actually really, really good. That is going to be my recommendations. So thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Take care.